I'm Chip Morris. I came to Chiapas in 1972, actually to study the language, and I got interested in textiles because I looked at the symbolic designs as if they were some kind of a language, which on a meta level they are. We also thought they were related to hieroglyphs. It turns out they're not. They're perhaps older than hieroglyphs, as a series of symbolic designs. I've been studying textiles for almost 40 years now. And they remain interesting because they keep on telling me different things. Right now, I'm interested in seeing how fashion works. And that in a tradition that's millennial old, I mean, they've been weaving for over 3,000 years, that there can be rapid changes without destroying the tradition. In fact, it really enlivens the tradition. This is something we didn't expect. It certainly wasn't going on 40 years ago. The Indians were much poorer, and basically what they wore is what their grandparents wore. It was very, very similar. It was very subtle changes. Now things are changing every day. New things being added, new techniques, new ideas. And it follows, or it's expressing the resurgence of Maya culture in island Chiapas as well. I've written a number of books under my formal name, which is Walter Francis Morris, Jr. And what we're really interested in is open plain weave. This is from the Nabalone collection. This is from Carranza, an old style. And what's interesting about this cloth to begin with is how transparent it is. It's just open plain. And this has brocaded designs on it. The ones along the bottom edge of burrs, for instance. Open plain weave has been used by the Maya since the formative period. We can see textile impressions on clay dating as far back as 1400 BC with open plain weave woven in it. I know I studied the textile impressions of Lagatero, a classic Maya site, 357 examples of open plain weave. It was a common cloth that they were using just to work the clay with. Post-classics examples from the Soconusco coast, open plain weave. It was a very common type of weaving. Now, when we look at the textiles of Chichen Itza, you've got open plain weave that's brocaded with different designs. And if you look at the murals of Bonampak, also late classic period, then you have open plain weave with brocaded designs very similar to Carranza and to Coban. So we think that the traditions of both Coban and Carranza trace directly back to the classic Maya period. One of the things that's happening in Maya tradition right now is that they are not only inventing new things, but there's also retro movements to study what was being done before. This is a retro piece. This is a piece that's imitating what was worn 30 years ago. It's, as she said, it's the older design. It has acrylic yarns on the sleeves instead of silk or rayon, which is what would have been used 30 years ago. But this very simple black is indicative of that time period. Actually, what tradition tends to say that whatever my grandmother wore is what has been worn since time immemorial, which is of course not true. But people do, in all cultures apparently, do believe that. What the great-grandmother wore was slightly different. This is probably a piece from the 1930s. I can't really date it clearly. This has been restored. And you can see it's blue. The valley around, the Grijalva Valley around Carranza was a major producer of indigo up until the mid-19th century when German aniline dyes basically destroyed that market. But there was a lot of blue around. It would have been the most common thing. And the huipiles and men's shirts, men's pants were all dyed blue up until, I'm guessing, 1935, 1940, sometime like that. So it's interesting in that blue basically disappears in the 20th century everywhere else. And everyone's wearing red. until the 21st century, until about a decade ago, when both in the Highlands and in Carranza, blue comes back, but as a modern color, as a break with tradition. So this is a modern piece. Also done in blue, but with red in the center, which was a style from the 1970s, but now, because his grandma's thought it's traditional. One of the things that's happening is, there's much more design work. It's extremely finely done, almost overdone. This was woven for a weaving contest, but I also saw people on the street in Carranza wearing pieces this fine during the festivals. So fashions in Maya world are different, and they have to be traditional as well as being experimental. And that when you do something new, you tend to harken back to something very old at the same time. So here she's showing off what a great weaver she is. There's been other changes, not just in the open plain weaving. Now, just briefly, there are pieces that are not open plain weave, such as a skirt. It would be a little embarrassing to be wearing a transparent skirt if you were a Maya. They used to not bother to wear huipiles. Those are sort of adornments. Breasts were considered baby bottles and not particularly attractive, but skirts were important. This is a traditional skirt, embroidered, but with a hem, and not quite as wide as the original skirts would have been, almost twice as wide as this. But has wonderful embroidered designs that imitating the brocade designs. There are trees, birds' heads, arches. This is a different skirt. This is the modern version. Elastic band, but you know, and so that you can wear it as a skirt the way you wear it today. But you notice the designs, although simplified because it's somewhat retro, trying to be very traditional, are the same designs embroidered on the piece. And this is hand woven as well. You can see that black zigzag brocade into the skirt material. You notice there is no belt. Belts were introduced in the colonial period. Before, when we just take the bulk of the skirt and tie a knot on the side, which formed a little bag. There's still a few communities, some ladies in Carranza, some Chol women, there's a few Delta women who still wear the skirt in that style, but it's now very rare. Okay, yes, I've written a number of books. The first one was on the symbology of designs. That was my main interest. I then wrote a catalog. I made a large collection for Francesco Polizzi and wrote a catalog of that collection in 2 volumes. Then I wrote, it was an exhibit guide to an exhibit that never was barely open, called The Millennium of Weaving in Chiapas, a small booklet. Then Living Maya. Living Maya was sort of an ethnography, but using the textiles to describe what was going on in the culture in many cases. Because I see, for me, looking at the textiles being the most elaborate visual form of art that's in the Maya today. There's some painters and sculptors, but really the visual artists in the population are the weavers. And they, of course, art is expressive, and so by looking at the art, you can learn a great deal about the culture. I've written a number of articles. The last book just came out, called The Textile Guide to Highland Chiapas. And we had such great photographs that we made it even bigger and more pretty. It is trying to describe what happened in the last decade, very briefly, of how all these changes have happened. Zina Kantan went from red to blue, and changed techniques a number of times. What is going on in about the 18 communities near San Cristobal? Each have very distinct dress and very distinct styles. terms of working with weavers, in the 1970s, I was working with Indians and some other volunteers to set up a co-op called Snaholobil, the House of Weaving. Snaholobil, after a couple of years of real difficulties, became fairly successful. And by the mid-80s, it was clear that they didn't really need my assistance anymore, and I was just too pushy and bossy. And so I let them be. So they've been running their own business for a long time, 25 years. They do a very good job. They have exquisite pieces. So it's a all Maya organization, men and women. At the time it was set up in the 70s, there was none of the women had a third grade education. So they needed to have male administrators. And later on they said, you know, we don't like that aspect of the work, anyways, we'd rather be weaving. In the 90s, they surprised me, very much so, because I didn't find out for another decade, that they were inviting men to become weavers as well, for production work, like doing pillowcases and things. So it turns out maybe a quarter of Snaholobil's membership is now male. It was an important organization, it still is, but it was the first Indian business that opened in San Cristobal. And in the 1970s, San Cristobal was just ending the colonial period. Literally, Indians were not allowed to walk the streets at night. They would be thrown in jail. They weren't allowed to walk on the sidewalks, and they certainly weren't allowed to live in San Cristobal. Snaholobil was very important, and it broke ground in a couple of major areas. And probably got away with it because people don't find weaving offensive or political, and so we opened the first Indian store in San Cristobal at a time when Indians were not allowed on the streets at night. They'd be thrown in jail. Weren't allowed to walk on sidewalks. They'd be pushed off. It was apartheid. Just on the other side, of course, non-Indians were not allowed to live in Maya villages, in most of them. So it was a first Indian business, and it was a women's business. And as an anthropologist friend pointed out to me later, they said, well, the men started looking at this and saying, wait a minute, if the women can do this, we can do this too. So it started a real change in Indian attitudes here. Now, 35 years later, San Cristobal, half the population is Indian. This is a dramatic change, one that no one has really fully digested and will cause a much more impact. San Cristobal is a lot more crowded and a lot larger than it was. It used to be a very pretty little city, but isolated. Now it's a larger city and multicultural to a huge extent. So that will be interesting. Now the other was that it being a women's business. It empowered women. Weavers don't make a lot of money after weaving. It doesn't matter how much you're selling it for. It's 1,000 pesos or 10,000 pesos. It's always taken far more time than what you're paying for. But they do make some money. And the successful weavers are those living a couple hours outside of San Cristobal, where they have a little more land. You know, they have their own house. They grow some of their own food. So they don't need a lot of money to live reasonably well, but they do need some for medicine, for school, for their kids. And that's what Snaholobil did, was have women be able to maintain their family in a much better form. This caused a lot of problems, especially in 1985 during the Mexican crash, in which the men who were working as day laborers in other parts of Mexico all came back home and there was no work, but the women were selling textiles. That led to a lot of wife beating, moaning, screaming, yelling for a year or two until the men realized this was really stupid and started helping their wives. And that's become much more of a practice ever since, all through. So it really is the beginning of feminism in Chiapas. There was a play written, Fatal Inheritance, written by some Indian playwrights. It talked about a woman, based on a true story, who inherited land in Chiapas. She was in there. And her brother said, well, you can't work the land by yourself, we'll do it for you. And she said, no, I'm going to take care of the land and it's going to be mine. He said, well, how will you ever get any money? And she says, well, I'm just going to the weaving co-op. I'll be selling my goods. I'll have money. They were so infuriated they killed her. So, I mean, the changes have not been easy, but they are quite different. I mean, 4 years ago, the Rockefeller Fellows came down and talked to Indian women, and I was a translator. And the fellows from the United States all said, well, we're professionals, and we're professional women, and we run our business, and we take care of our families. The Indian women looked up and said, well, we're professionals too. We take care of our family, we run our business. So, and our husbands do help us do the chores. So it's quite different, very nice. This little row on the bottom is moot, bird. And you can see the little, oops, yes, it's moot. Yeah. It has a little beak, bird head, tail feathers back here, 2 legs. Now, the head is a diamond, so this diamond above it is called bird's heads. And other places would have a completely different name. This one's just called inclined. Now, what it is with the spikes off the side is the center part of the feathered serpent body, which is a very ancient symbol, but it's not named that. This is just called arches when it zigzags back and forth. It can have other names in other places. And up here, this is just called chohak, or rings or net bag, I mean the empty spaces between it. And that one at the very top is 9 bird heads. I spent a lot of time talking to women about designs. Many women do not know the names of designs. The designs are often disputed as they can have different interpretations. When I was working with Phone Art, a Mexican folk art agency in the 70s, and with Snaholobil, I would interview every woman I talked to when I was buying pieces or working with weavers, which meant I interviewed about 3,000 women. That's how I know the names of the designs. Now, the names can also change in time. They may not be the same names right now. In Carranza, you might find other things. People use symbols without necessarily knowing it. Who do you know when they set up a Christmas tree is thinking of Druidic theology? We don't think about solstitial period and Christmas. We just put up the tree because we'll always have this tradition. It's really nice. That's much of how weavers look upon weaving. This is how it should be. It's from the beginning of the world, when we were first taught how to weave, which turns out to be quite true. It's thousands of years old, and we just like doing it. John Clark, who was of the New World Archaeological Foundation, went through the ceramics from a site on the Soconusco coast, which is formative Olmec, about 1400 BC. And there are clear impressions of textiles on the pottery. It's the first example of textiles weaving. And it's in twill and plain weave, as far as I can tell. I still haven't finished that study. What for me is very interesting is also when Ocos pottery appears. Ocos pottery is the first pottery in Mesoamerica as well. And Ocos is right nearby. So you have the first pottery and the first weaving appear simultaneously. And what is very strange is the first pottery is beautifully made. They're not lumpy, crude things. They're exquisite, delicate, wonderfully shaped, and decorated, fortunately, with impressions of cording and of textiles. The textiles are extremely well made. They're as fine as this thread. It's finer than a hair. These are the first pieces. Now, normally your first piece isn't really good, so we think that probably came over from somewhere else. Ocos pottery is very, very similar to pottery of the same time period from northern Japan, which at that time would have been Ainu, not the Japanese. The weaving could have come with the same ship, shipwreck, exploration party, colony, whatever it was. There's no real signs of it. I've heard theories that backstrap loom came across the Pacific to the Pacific Islands because the backstrap loom is used all the way across there. That seems possible. And if you walk off track in the Pacific Islands, you eventually wash up somewhere in the Americas. It's believed that's how Peruvians learn weaving as well, with someone washing up from the Pacific Islands. And I say it's believed because we don't know. But I'm inclined to think it came from the outside only because the first examples are so good. There are earlier examples of things like net bags, cording, other techniques. So it's possible that someone just invented it and did a great job right away, but doubtful.